Had Mao died in 1956, his achievements would have been immortal. Had he died in 1966, he would still have been a great man, but he died in 1976. Alas, what can one say? That is an incredibly striking quote by Chen Yun, and it perfectly sets the stage for what we're talking about today. You know, when we look back at history, especially the history of powerful states and complex leaders, the legacy they leave behind is almost never simple. It's fiercely debated, meticulously constructed, and often completely rewritten as the decades roll by.
Welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving into a really fascinating theme: how state powers construct, control, and evolve their narratives over time. We're going to look specifically at how the story of Mao Zedong and the incredibly turbulent era of the Cultural Revolution has been handled by historians, by the state, and by everyday people. And then we'll contrast all of that with the much more outward-looking global strategies we see today. Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, cultivating Chairman Mao. Second, the archive gap. Third, decoding the revolution. And finally, modern global narratives.
Starting off with Section 1, Cultivating Chairman Mao, the Cult and the Chaos.
Okay, to really understand this narrative, we first have to wrap our heads around the immense scale of what actually happened. Initiated back in 1966, the Cultural Revolution was a decade of intense, massive political upheaval in China. The human cost was staggering. We're talking about schools shutting down, factions literally warring against each other in the streets, and millions of people experiencing severe persecution. It was an era where Mao's personality cult reached its absolute climax, which fueled a kind of factional civil war that stunted the nation's growth across almost every single sector. Now, processing that sheer level of societal trauma eventually led to the emergence of what's called scar literature, or Shanghai Shui, which popped up around 1978 to 1979 during a brief period of moderate liberalization called the Beijing Spring. This was a profoundly cathartic form of writing. Victims finally had a platform to describe the intense suffering they endured. But here's the really interesting part. This literature served a highly strategic dual purpose. Yes, it was a way to process immense trauma, but it also functioned as a state-sanctioned way to subtly criticize the ruling party's past actions. By placing the blame squarely on a select political group known as the Gang of Four, writers could expose the horrors of the era while still staying safely within the permissible bounds of state discourse.
Moving right along to Section 2, the archive gap, history under lock and key. Imagine you're a historian trying to study this period today. You are essentially forced to become a detective. Why? Because the official domestic story is still tightly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. For instance, there was an archive law passed in 1987 that supposedly made documents open to the public after 30 years. Sounds great, right? Well, there are massive exemptions for anything deemed a matter of state security or foreign relations. So historians find themselves navigating this murky landscape heavily shrouded in official secrecy. And it is absolutely fascinating to observe how a state handles the legacy of its founding figure when that figure is tied to such massive upheaval. Get this, in 1981, the Communist Party passed a resolution that offered a highly specific mathematical quantification of Mao's legacy. They officially declared Chairman Mao to be 70% right and 30% wrong. Just think about that formula for a second. It was a brilliantly calculated piece of political narrative building. It allowed the party to acknowledge the heavy losses of the Cultural Revolution, again, placing the blame on those no longer in power, while simultaneously protecting Mao's legacy as a founding father. By doing that, they essentially insulated and protected the party's overall historical legitimacy.
This tight control of the narrative actually leads to a pretty blatant, almost surreal contradiction in modern society. On the one hand, you have heavy state censorship. Textbooks completely omit key elements of the Cultural Revolution, public discourse is muted, and cemeteries holding victims are sometimes actually protected by surveillance cameras and kept unmarked. But on the exact same token, you have this wild hyper-visibility of Mao in modern commercial culture. You can go out and find Mao pop art, buy relics at market stalls, and believe it or not, even dine at Cultural Revolution-themed restaurants. It is a bizarre juxtaposition, right? It's basically a state-sponsored public amnesia, all mixed up with commercial nostalgia.
Now, to really ground the massive, somewhat abstract scale of this personality cult into something tangible, let me share a completely wild historical anecdote with you: the 1968 Mango Cult. So in August 1968, Mao received a crate of mangoes from the Pakistani foreign minister. Mao decided to gift these mangoes to factory workers who had just helped quell violent clashes among the student Red Guards. This simple act signaled a monumental political shift. Mao was transferring his faith away from the youth and back to the working proletariat. But the reaction on the ground? It was unbelievable. It spawned a spontaneous, fervent commodity cult. People literally preserve the mangoes, worship them, and turn them into these massive propagandistic symbols. It really shows just how intensely the personality cult had permeated everyday objects and everyday lives.
Let's move into Section 3, Decoding the Revolution, Historians as Detectives.
So despite that massive archive gap and the state's tight grip on the narrative we just talked about, Western academics have never stopped hunting for answers, slowly piecing together the puzzle of the Cultural Revolution over the decades. When you map out the historiographical evolution, basically how the history of this history was written, a really clear shift happens. Early on, you had works like Robert J. Lifton's 1968 book, which was actually written while Mao was still alive and the revolution was actively happening. These early works focused heavily on a great man theory, looking specifically at Mao the individual, his culpability, and his actions from the top down. But as we move forward in time, looking at Anita Chan in the 80s all the way to He Cheng-tan in 2017, the focus drops down to the grassroots level. Modern historians became way more interested in localized social histories. They wanted to give agency to the ordinary people and examine the crazy multiplicity of realities that were occurring on the ground.
To really get this, it's crucial to understand the specific frameworks these historians were using. Let's look back at Lifton's 1968 work. He used a rather niche framework called psychohistory. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean sitting Mao on a couch and diagnosing him with a clinical illness. Rather, it's a framework used to understand massive historical events through the lens of psychological motivations. Lifton theorized that Mao orchestrated the chaos of the Cultural Revolution as a desperate grasp for symbolic immortality. Mao was getting older, and he was deeply, deeply afraid that after his physical death, the party would abandon his ideals and take a capitalist road. Thus, the revolution was essentially a radical, destructive attempt to preserve the fervent, pure passion of Communist China against that symbolic death.
But as we noted, that was very much a top-down approach. Lifton focused on Mao's fears, his thoughts, and his deliberate purges. Contrast that with Anita Chan's bottom-up history in 1985. She completely flipped the script. She didn't just point the finger at Mao at the top. She looked at the ordinary youth on the ground. Chan argued that the zealous, sometimes violent participation of the Red Guards was actually the product of an authoritarian personality. And this wasn't just some uniquely Chinese phenomenon either. She argued it was the direct result of intense psychological conditioning and political socialization fostered by the centralized state education system of the 1950s. By actually interviewing former Red Guards who had relocated to Hong Kong, Chan was able to bring these massive, broad historical strokes down to a very specific human level. Through those interviews, she identified 4 distinct archetypes of student activists. You had the conforming activist, the purist activist, the rebellious activist, and the pragmatic activist. This is so important because it illustrates just how complex the movement actually was. It wasn't just a monolithic, faceless block of brainwashed youth. It was made up of unique individuals reacting very differently to immense peer pressure and incredibly strict social environments. All right, let's head into our final section, Modern Global Narratives, from Isolation to Integration. So far, we've been looking at the historically isolated, heavily closed-off narratives of the 1960s. We've seen how the domestic narrative was meticulously controlled in the past. But now, I want us to fast forward to the present. I want you to think about this question. How has China's narrative strategy evolved today? We've talked about censorship, about the 70-30 split, about keeping the domestic archive under lock and key. But today, China is a massive burgeoning global power, literally leading the way in infrastructure and global trade. The narrative strategy required to pull that off on the world stage is vastly, vastly different from the one required during a localized domestic cultural revolution. When you put them side by side, there is a stark, almost night-and-day contrast between the state endeavors of the past, like the Cultural Revolution, and modern initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. Think about the focus. The Cultural Revolution was strictly domestic. It relied on absolute top-down control, heavy censorship, and projecting an extreme personality cult centered on one man. In stark contrast, modern state endeavors like the BRI are explicitly global and international. Instead of isolation, the entire strategy revolves around things like joint ventures and open bidding for international companies. The projected image is entirely different now. It's no longer purely a Chinese endeavor tightly wrapped around a single supreme leader. The narrative is deliberately, carefully crafted to project the image of a collaborative, reliable global partner.
So what does this all tell us? Well, it tells us that state narratives are never static. They aren't just history. They are active, evolving tools. Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought for you to take away from this explainer today. How does controlling the history of the past influence a nation's power in the present? By carefully curating and essentially managing the turbulent legacy of the Cultural Revolution at home, while simultaneously projecting a collaborative, open image abroad, we are seeing statecraft functioning at its highest level of complexity. The history we are allowed to remember absolutely, undeniably shapes the geopolitical reality we live in today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.